Are we headed for civil war?
Yes, probably.
That's quite scary.
Yes, it is. There is a very significant probability of this occurring within 5 years.
What are the chances that it doesn't happen?
We are past the point at which there is a political off-ramp. Dear elites, the consequences of your actions have arrived. The shit's hit the fan. But it's worse than that, I think.
Would you advise people to think about getting out?
I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to run. If it breaks out in one place, say Ireland or France or Germany, it will spread elsewhere.
You envision many deaths?
Yeah, exactly. It will metastasize fairly rapidly into straight interethnic. And my best advice for people...
How will we see the first moments of civil war happen? Many of you have asked me, why do you ask people to subscribe? So let's look at the analytics. When I didn't remind viewers in the recent Peter Bleksley episode, the channel got 137 new subscribers. But when I asked you to subscribe before Raj and Mia's episode, 16,300 of you did. There's more where that came from because 46% of you subscribe, meaning 54% can click, hit the subscribe button. Now enjoy the show. Professor David Betz, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
Tell me a bit, before we launch into civil war and all of those things, tell me a little bit about your credentials.
I'm a professor in the War Studies Department at King's College London, where I've been for the last 25 years. I did my PhD here in the UK, but I'm Canadian originally. My area of interest has been, or essentially my academic title is Professor of War in the Modern World, which is pretty broad, but also indicative of my interest. I tend to be working on wherever the war is on a given time. For most of the last 25 years, I've been working on irregular war, and mostly the informational aspects, or the psychological and dimension of irregular conflicts, because that's been the mainstream of conflict in our world for much of the time in which I've been a professional scholar on the issues. So that's essentially my background. I'm a mainstream academic in a well-known department in a quite reputable UK university with a particular specialism in irregular conflict.
Which is really important because, I mean, I've been saying for some time, oh gosh, I bet we're headed for civil war here. But I'm just an idiot and I know nothing. And I want viewers to remember that. But you're a proper person. And so, are we headed for civil war?
Yes, probably.
That's quite scary.
Yes, it is. It is scary. I agree.
Oh, okay. Well, where to begin? I mean, I suppose, what are the chances that it doesn't happen?
If it's a slightly complicated question, but I like to answer that, just on the basis of the existing literature and the consensus view, or at least in the estimation of what I think is probably the best recent work on the subject. It's which is a book by the American scholar Barbara Walter, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them is the subtitle. She concludes that in any given year in which the conditions of civil war are present, the chances of it actually breaking out are about 4%. So my argument essentially is based around that number. I find it credible. People might interrogate her number, but for purposes of argument, I just accept that that 4% is reasonable. I'm convinced by her scholarship on that point. So if you look out over 5 years and you work out the maths of that in any one country, I just pick the UK, for example, it comes out to about 18.5%, or literally 18.61, I think it is, something like that. Anyway, the numbers, I'm not a quantitative political scientist. I'm not particularly obsessing over the numbers, but it comes out to somewhere around 18%.
But why is that?
That's just the way the maths work. If you accept that there's a 4% or do you mean what are the underlying conditions, or what?
Well, how do you get 18?
If you take on an annual basis, there is a 4% possibility of something occurring, and you project that out over 5 years, then the total aggregate potential over 5 years is 18%.
Okay.
Do you follow?
And it's very likely this would happen in the next 25 years. Is that? Can we extrapolate?
Well, I haven't gone that far. I tend to think more over the next 5 years. And when you could, from a statistical point of view, you could work the numbers out to 25 or 125 or 25,000. That's not the problem. I'm just I tend not to do that personally because the underlying premise of the question are the existence of the conditions that are indicative of civil war. And I think that one can show very convincingly in my view that currently those conditions exist and they are very likely to continue to exist. And in fact, I suspect to magnify over the next 5 years or so. After this, much further than that, I wouldn't wish to wish to predict or speculate. I think I'm going as far as I might reasonably go. But it's essentially, in answer to your original question, if you start with 4%, you work it out over 5, you get to a number that's somewhere around 18. Then I think, however, which is a pretty scary figure, right? But it's worse than that, I think, when you think about it, because it's a very connected world. One of the most significant indicators of the likelihood of civil war breaking out in one place, all things being equal, is whether or not one's neighbor is in a state of civil war. So really, you have to take into account the total kind of, you need to take into account the regional space when you start to make this sort of calculation, my point of view. In which case, then, if we were to take just Britain as an example in the first instance, and then to ask about its neighbors, and one can make the case, indeed, I do make the case that this isn't a specifically British problem. These conditions are prevalent more or less throughout the Western world and very heavily throughout Western Europe. You have to then say, well, that it's very likely if it breaks out in any one place, it will spread to others. It's not a sure thing that it would spread, but it is quite likely. So if we just say arbitrarily that the chances of it transmitting from one place to another are, say, 50%, then, and the potential for it to break out exists in 10 or 15 different countries that are in close proximity and close connection, then that 18% again gets multiplied. As I said, I'm not a quantitative political scientist. I'm not trying a numbers game. I'm simply trying to say in human terms that there is a very significant probability of this occurring within 5 years on account of the existence of the indicative conditions for civil war being frankly, very obvious, and obvious across a range of countries which are connected in a manner which means that if it breaks out in one place, say Ireland or France or Germany, Italy, Portugal, Sweden, it will spread elsewhere.
Are we talking about, and I've heard you speak, and you speak very with a lot of nuance and about urban versus rural and all sorts of things, but are we essentially in the West talking about the issue of Islamism?
No. That is one half of the equation, in my view. I think there are two. I call them vectors, but let's call them. You choose your own term: aspect, factor. So I think there are two vectors. One is an interethnic conflict, which does have at its heart conflict with which we've been dealing as a society for coming on 25 years. 25 years now, is familiar to people. It's the subtext of the war on terror and much else. It is the the factor which has driven much of the obvious reshaping of the urban landscape, so on and so forth. So that's one vector. The second vector is more of the nature, I think, of a peasant revolt. I'm not using this, I don't use the term peasant revolt in a disparaging manner. What I'm talking about is a form of internal conflict that arises out of a feeling amongst the majority populace that they have been that the elite is changing the rules of the game in some way, which is seriously invidious of their potential well-being and against which they are reacting strongly. These two vectors interact. So on the one hand, as you and your listeners will well know, there is a very frequent now discussion of post-national elites, which talks about them having betrayed their own countries. Essentially, we have the situation perceived by many in which national leaders are themselves post-national in their orientation. They don't care about their countries, or indeed, right. There are two levels of conflict. Mm-hmm. One is leading to a kind of Ulsterization. The other is leading to a kind of Balkanization. And they're both happening at the same time and interacting with each other and effectively driving each other.
Bloody hell. Okay, so I suppose to just summarize what you're saying, there were two very important aspects to why we're about to go into civil war. One, potentially being the sort of multi-ethnicities and multicultural aspect. I think Islamism, I think it's fair to say Islamism is a huge part of that. And the other being the sort of elite post-national, as you say. So that's sort of moving beyond being in favor of, is that kind of feeling people have of we're just an airport now?
Yes.
And when you put those two together, the conditions for civil war make it quite likely that in the next few years it will happen.
Yes.
How is an example of that then, when you talk about the elite sort of doing these things that are just nuts to normal people, mm-hmm. Just in the last few days I've seen that Prevent, the anti-terrorist organization, has now said that people who believe that Western culture is at risk from other cultures are now on the terrorist watch list or something to that effect. Is that an example?
Yeah, that's a terrific example. That's effectively a declaration on the part of the government that they haven't the faintest idea what the mainstream attitude of the population is. Or it may be that they have a very good appreciation of what the mainstream attitude of the population is, and they've decided that they are going to try to repress it.
Why? Why do they do that?
I think that ultimately the main reason for this is in fact that national governments throughout the West are populated by people who are fundamentally post-national in their outlook. They're educated to be highly skeptical of nationalism. They're actually skeptical is being charitive. They're very suspicious of nationalism as being not just passé, but actually morally dubious as an approach. They don't think in terms of national interest, and I think they're actually not able to think in terms of national interest. And so we have an ironic and ultimately rather tragic situation in which we have these things called nation states, which continue to exist, but which are run by people who don't have a great deal of affinity for the states that for the nations that they represent, though they are perfectly able as smooth political operators to employ the relevant rhetoric when it's necessary for them. Most obviously, recently in the context of calls for national mobilization in regard to the increasingly fraught situation in Ukraine and the ongoing conflict with Russia and China and so on and so forth.
Ukraine flags.
All right, so there is an attempt to flag wave or to push the collective we idea, but it rather fails. It seems frankly ludicrous in an environment or when it's coming from exactly the same people who have spent the last generation destroying any sensible notion of a collective we. So you can't pull that lever anymore.
You're saying it's sort of a hypocrisy that there's this kind of the Ukraine flags and you buy it everywhere. Everyone's, let's get behind you, and we can't even get behind our own country as a symbol of anything. Do you notice it being even worse here than say in Canada or USA, where at least whenever I've been there, there's flags. You've got the Canadian flag, the American flag. People, is it even worse here than the incentive to not be nationalistic?
That's a good question. I happen to live in Britain, and so I'm most familiar with that as an example, and that probably biases me to think that it must be the worst here. It's just because you're confronted with it more. I think that might be the case if I try to just take a step back from my own kind of subjective immersion in Britain and constant confrontation with that idea. Then I think one might say it is pretty bad in the UK. After all, this is a country where I forget which Labour politician it was who took time out of her day to post on Twitter about one of her constituents flying an England flag on St. George's Day from the window of his own home. Yeah. As being a particular, your listeners will
Emily
remember,
Thornbury,
right? That's a pretty obvious and egregious example of what I'm describing. That was 7 or 8 years ago. Now that I think about it, so that seems pretty typical here in Britain. But I wouldn't say that there's a great deal of difference, frankly. I'm certainly, after Britain, I'm relatively familiar with the Canadian scene. Trudeau, rather remarkably, very early on in his premiership, declared Canada to be the first post-national country.
They're not hiding it then?
Yeah, no, he wasn't hiding it. He wasn't ashamed by it. And I think he's probably still not ashamed by it.
Do they sing the national anthem anymore? Airport. What do you sing?
Well, very recently they have been in great numbers. Trump has been terrific in that sense for animating. I think a fairly large number of Canadians to an overt displays of national pride that had become atypical recently, but it's still a country that I'm not trying to suggest that you can't find Canadians who are proud of their country, but I'm also not suggesting that you can't find Britons that are intensely proud of their country. It's just they're considered to be rather suspicious and disreputable figures, and they might well have met their member of parliament calling them out for being dinosaurs and rather passé as a result of it.
What's really frustrating about this is that sort of the supposed right-wing national group, which doesn't seem to be very large in the United Kingdom, if they keep being pushed so far to deny their nationality and not be proud and all of this and more immigration, all the things that they voted against, there will be a reaction, as you say. And I feel like the post-national argument will be, aha, you see? Do you know what I mean? It's like you can't win, because if they keep going the way they are, the politicians, the elites, it does lead to a civil war. They're going to feel vindicated, the elites I'm talking about, because they're going to say, you see, the right wing did rise up and fight. But they won't see, I suppose, but only because you pushed them into a corner for so many years. Do you see what I'm saying?
I'm not sure I do.
They feel like, it feels like I'm hearing from the government, okay, anybody who believes that their culture is being replaced is some sort of terrorist. Well, eventually, some of those people will react. You'll see people rise up in the streets and smash windows and attack mosques and such. And rather than those elites going, gosh, we really pushed those people into a corner, they'll be saying we were right all along by classifying them as terrorists.
Yeah, okay. I agree. That's exactly what they're going to do. Safely from their bunker in Switzerland or California or wherever they, these are. So yeah, I think that's very likely.
And how will we see the first echoes or the first moments of civil war happen?
I think it's a good question. I think we've already seen them. I say that somewhat guardedly, cautiously, but I feel going back to the vectors that I mentioned, I think the first noteworthy incidents in the second, which is the interethnic, have already been. We're already starting to see them occur. And it's clear that the government is very aware of this and extremely frightened by it. That was what was animating the reaction last summer to Southport, for example. The government is perfectly aware that focus groups done by all kinds of reputable agencies, including government agencies, are now coming out of meetings with normal middle-class people who are talking about civil war and civil conflict, and on a very regular basis. So I think we've already begun to see the first important aspects of this. Now, I want to stress that this is a very proto form of a sort of action that is going to become much more severe. And to get to the point, there are a couple of incidents that I think are very significant. First is the Blade Runners. The Blade Runners, as you know, here in London are an organization, I guess you might call it, or like an amorphous grassroots movement. Who knows how organized this is? But the fact of the matter is the Blade Runners, which is a group which has been targeting the cameras of the ULEZ, or the Low Emission Zone Enforcement camera scheme, have taken out somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 cameras, I think, at this stage, which is a lot of right. This is a lot of damage, mostly openly. They're generally conducting their operations in broad daylight, people walking by. It's a measurably large effect. 1,500 to 2,000 is a big number, a big cost.
Sure.
Total arrests, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there have been one arrest so far. Now, it would be hard to argue that the London mayor has not been paying attention to the Blade Runners. So this tells you something about the sorts of something of the character of the type of attack, of the efficacy of the attack, and of the ability of the state to defend itself. Okay?
Yeah, not very much ability to defend.
So they don't have very much. No, they that's, I think, a pretty reasonable conclusion empirically on the basis of the numbers I just presented, that the capability is pretty low, and that the support, that the kind of organic support from people for that kind of action is pretty high. Because if you're a Londoner in the areas where this is happening, you'll probably have seen it. Did you stop them? Did you call the police? Or did you walk by? Or did you clap? Did you say, good on you? My guess is that there's rather a lot more of the second than of the than of the first. Okay, another example might be in the lead up to the Paris Olympics, there were attacks on infrastructure, particularly specifically cyber attacks on infrastructure, which were deliberately designed to disrupt the Olympic Games. There have been other, so in both those cases, we know quite a lot and what their intent is. There are a number of other indicative examples, including the burning up of the electrical substation that served London Heathrow, and there have been more recently actually deliberate attacks on the French electrical infrastructure in the south of France. These are very small scale, but I think what they all represent is a tactic that is, the technical term for the tactic is system disruption. It's a very well-known idea in the literature on this issue that essentially works on the logic that by attacking infrastructure, by disrupting the system, you produce political effect, essentially. You further kludge up the system. Now, there are certain advantages of system disruption as a strategic mechanism. These are low scale, but in fact, you can have much bigger effect. And I think what the Heathrow incident made very, very clear is, I'm not suggesting the Heathrow incident was an insurgent attack. I don't know. It might well have just been completely accidental.
Sure.
But what we do know is that the disruption of one key electrical substation that was effectively unguarded caused a gigantic amount of economic damage to the country. So it's very obvious, I think, then that this is a tactic which can be used in order to disrupt the system, to cause the cities effectively to, ultimately to implode. Another advantage of system disruption as a strategy in the initial stages of civil conflict is that it's much easier to get people to break things than it is to get them to break people, right? Mm. As many people, sure you would say it's quite hard to get someone to kill someone else. I mean, for the most part, this is our society is not full of psychopaths, and the point of an insurgency is that you need to get normal people to do abnormal things. Getting people to break something, to break a camera, to burn up a substation, to cause a break in a logistical chain, to mess with transport infrastructure. These can have serious strategic effect, but the psychological barrier to entry to those sorts of operations is considerably lower. Mm.
I see. And so we've seen that kind of, I mean, it's devastation, isn't it? Those kinds of, that Heathrow shut down and all those kinds of things. And then how does it go? I think that's it. How does it leap from that into we're now in a civil war?
For an answer, I would ask you to imagine that scaling up. Mm. So it's not just affecting Heathrow, but it is affecting either the whole or significant parts of a big metropolitan area. Let's just take London for an example. And it's not just happening once in a while, once every 10 years or once every 20 years, but it's happening every 2 weeks. Okay? The power's going out, or the gas doesn't operate because someone's attack the gas network, right? So think back to the 2011 London riots. Mm. 2000, as again, many of your listeners might be familiar with this. These are riots which erupted quasi-spontaneously after the killing of a young guy by armed police here in London. The details of the incident are not particularly important to the story. The point is that the City of London, about 10 million population, was essentially shut down for a period of about a week by massive rioting over that period. Now, we should put some numbers to that word massive. It's estimated that on any given night during that period of rioting, there were maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people out rioting. And of those 2,000 to 3,000 people, probably maybe 200 to 300 were seriously violent. The ability of the police to control that situation was, well, let's say, massively overstretched. It was very, very difficult for them to regain control. Even with those numbers, which I said were massive, it was massive relatively for that time. But it's not actually that big for a city of 10 million people. Imagine that's happening because the power's out or the gas is out. It's the second or third time that that's happened in a winter. And it's not 2,000 people on the street, it's 20,000, it's 30,000. And it's not 200 or 300 hardcore violent, it's 2,000 or 3,000 who are really determined. And this isn't happening just once in a while, it's happening every 2 weeks through the winter. And every time things settle down, something else breaks because somebody breaks it. This is the essence of a strategic approach where you conduct an action with a view to creating a certain effect. Usually you combine that with other actions. So you might strike in one place with a view to creating a condition which is stretch security forces in one direction. You conduct another action in a different place.
And then
you can see how this can scale up, and the numbers required. So you don't need to mobilize. You're not mobilizing 30,000 people to go out onto the street. What you're doing is you're switching off the electricity. You're switching off the support systems to the urban environment, which keep those people on a normal basis from not losing it. And that can be done with quite low numbers of people.
So who are the two sides? Because I think a lot of people might have imagined, okay, this is going to be extreme Islam versus not, just sort of the white British population or the rest of the population who don't want that. But it sounds from what you're saying that it's actually more sort of just people versus the state.
I think it goes back to my point about there being two vectors here.
Yeah.
I think the essence of the second is that it's the much larger and much more dangerous conflict. I used the term balkanization to describe that. So your question was, who are the two sides? I don't think there will be two sides. It's going to be way more complicated than that. I mean, this is not untypical of civil wars for there to be, ultimately for there to be multiple sides. If we were to simplify, yes, I think one can say, look, it is the native population. And actually, there's a weird kind of neuro-linguistic difficulty going on here because it's quite hard to describe when you say the native population.
Yeah,
who are you? To whom are you referring? It's part of this, really grave semantic difficulty about talking about this this problem. But nonetheless, if we were to
Westerners, could you say the sort of people who are proud of Western values?
Maybe if you were, a common approach is to try to cut this as a cultural issue rather than as an ethnic issue. And I'm broadly inclined to approach myself, but I'm also rather pessimistic. So I think once things really kick off, it won't stay cultural. It's going to be far too complicated to interrogate people on their culture. It will metastasize fairly rapidly into straight interethnic. My best advice for people trying to get their heads around this is to listen to ex-Yugoslavs talk about the descent of Yugoslavia talk about the prelapsarian Yugoslavia before the outbreak of the civil war there in the early to mid 1990s, where things went, in their view, extremely rapidly from a sense of, that's behind us, it couldn't happen here, to bedlam, effectively, and to people and to a situation in which people, under conditions of very severe stress and fear, responded essentially by looking to the most simple characteristics of what community could provide them safety. And so I would like to say, okay, well, it'll be cultural because it's all about ideas, but it's not going to be like that. Once people start drilling out the kneecaps of each other's children and, throwing religious leaders off of highway overpasses and all of the other things that have happened in civil conflicts in other areas of the world, I just think those niceties will fall away.
So how will you know who your enemy is?
It's very, very difficult. In a nutshell, the way it goes is that there is a period of violence and breakdown which causes people to effectively to flee, and as they flee, what they're doing is it's a kind of assortative movement. So you already see it already. In fact, to some extent, in the middle classes leaving the cities, leaving the big urban centers and moving to either to smaller urban centers or to the countryside.
Yeah.
So that's already happened. That's been happening for ages. I mean, the government's been documenting this back to the Casey report, which I think was 2016, something like that. So you get this period of violence where the shit's hit the fan, basically. Okay, and what people do, what happens then is the people who have not already fled under conditions in which their movement would not have necessarily have been interpreted overtly as fleeing, now begin to move, and they move in an assortative way. So they look around. Now they're looking around. Where am I going to be safe? And you just scale that up. There are basically hundreds of thousands of people making that decision. Who is my tribe? Where are they? Where can I go? And they go there. In the process of this assortative movement, people are experiencing loss. So it's quite likely, right, if you leave your home under such conditions, you're not selling your home. You're not realizing the benefits of this. You are in flight, so you have a major loss. You might have suffered violence directly. But the point is that as people begin to make these decisions and to move, they begin to select their tribe. And they also begin to have a direct experience of victimization, which increases their sense of grievance and reduces the entry costs to further violence. This is why when people talk about civil wars metaphorically, they often talk about the tipping point, right? things rolling downhill and getting increasingly violent and increasingly quick as it goes along. So that's
it's not a very it's not something to look forward to, I suppose. Would you advise people to think about getting out of the country? And where would you go?
That's a great question. I don't think there really is an obvious place to go. If it would been 400 years ago, and the English Civil War had just wrapped up, you could say, and you weren't content with the post-Civil War status quo. You could get on the Mayflower and cross the Atlantic and go create New England on the other side of the Atlantic. There's no terra nulla anymore. There's no empty space to go to. So that the question you ask is a very difficult one to answer. Actually, I'm being evasive, but there is no place to go.
South America.
Well, okay.
Try your luck.
Go for it. Look, bottom line is that the world is more full in a way than it was in other periods where one might suggest there was a potential for dissidents, to go someplace else and create a new world. That's not here. Maybe Elon will open up Mars and you can go. But in the meanwhile, it isn't really obvious where one can go to be safe from the situation.
Especially with your implication that once one domino falls, it feels like the whole of Europe will be at some kind of civil war. It's not going to be easy to find somewhere to go.
I struggle to see how, once it kicks off anywhere in Western Europe, that it won't spread elsewhere. It's just, we've spent the last 50 years creating a borderless Europe. So it's going to be hard to contain the forces that will be generated as society begins actively to peel itself apart. You will have people moving, as I said, and you will have repercussions that will propagate from there. Currently, I think, for example, it might well be that things kick off in Ireland, ironically enough. But I mean, people I think are increasingly at a boiling point there. One can see from the British perspective how pretty easily that could
transmit here.
That could transmit here. Although effectively we're talking about a country of Ireland's 6 million people, something like that, to a country of, well, officially 65 million, but probably upwards of 70 million. But it would spread, I think, pretty rapidly.
And how might one avert this? What can governments do?
Yeah.
Shutting the borders?
Do you mean how they might prevent the spread or prevent the outbreak?
The outbreak, I think. So many people are upset. I mean, immigration in the last few years, more than ever in the UK, has become the number one topic that's upsetting, that the average person feels the elites are not listening to them about. Yeah.
I didn't mean to laugh. What that laugh you just heard was a defense mechanism. It wasn't a genuine laugh because the answer is far from amusing, and that is, there isn't anything they can do. This is baked in. We're already past the tipping point, is my estimation. By tipping point, so here I should be precise. I mean, we are past the point at which there is a political off-ramp, right? We're past the point at which normal politics is able to solve the problem. So almost every plausible way forward from here involves some kind of violence, in my view. So anything the government tries to do at this point is going to, it could try to solve one problem, but it's going to aggravate a different problem in doing so, and you get back to violence. So the question really is about mitigating the costs, to my mind, not about preventing the outcome. I'm sorry to say, many other people in the country, maybe many people brighter than me, but I have not heard a plausible political way forward, and I don't see a single political figure who is credible credible in the role of national savior, or even inclined, frankly. I mean, just speaking of the UK, or even inclined to do so. So I think we're past the tipping point. The question is mitigation of the effects. The most important thing in mitigating the effects is to limit the period, right? You definitely don't want to. The worst thing is you don't want it. You want it to be as short as possible, but that's as best as I can suggest. And it would probably do to think sensibly about the protection of certain things we know on the basis of other civil wars, both contemporary and historical, are likely to be threatened. Mm. So things like, I would suggest that that a very serious look at cultural protection. One of the very typical aspects of civil wars is iconoclasm, the smashing of cultural totems. Yeah. Also, basically, just straight up vandalism and theft of things. Britain, again, I'm focusing on Britain because we happen to be in Britain, but I'll just reiterate, this is not just a British problem. But Britain is a particularly culturally rich country. There is a lot of treasure, most of it's just lying around. So I think some serious efforts to thought about how to protect that stuff would be in order. I think some prior working out of possibilities of safe areas in the hope of reducing some of the effect of out-migration. So, by which I mean, people who have the possibility, who have mobile wealth or globally marketable skills, probably have the wherewithal to flee. It's the essence of refugee dynamic, right? It's probably sensible to think in the long term about mitigating the brain drain effect of that. So if you can create areas in which to some degree of normal civil life can continue during a period of intense internal conflict can occur, that would be that would, I think, be beneficial. And thirdly, I think for those for those countries which are heretofore highly functioning, highly advanced, and very well armed, specifically the nuclear powers, we haven't had a nuclear power completely break down. Everybody now is just screaming USSR right now as I say these words. Yes, the USSR broke down, but one of the very significant aspects of the breakdown of the USSR was the continuing sovereignty over the USSR's nuclear assets. And after the collapse of the USSR, there was a great deal of interest on the part of the international community, particularly led by the United States, but also on the part of the successor states, notably Russia, to keep control of that stuff for reasons that are completely obvious. But I think a bit of planning at this stage also about where all that stuff is. How is it accounted? How is it secured? What are the backup plans for if it becomes threatened? These are things that perhaps quietly, I don't know how you could do this quietly, but these are things that I would wish to think about. But the bottom line in answer to your question is, I don't think that there is now a political solution to this, which takes the form of everything just kind of working out okay after some period of difficulty. It is going to get, things are bad now, but they are going to get very much worse. And hopefully after they will get better. But you are going to have to go through a period of very much worse before you get there.
Do you envision many deaths?
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't be speaking if I didn't.
Hundreds of thousands?
I don't want to be drawn. I'd rather present a range. If it is the case of, let's say things are only as bad as the worst year of Northern Ireland, right? Which, if I recall correctly, is 1971, and about 500 deaths in a population of the Northern Ireland size. If you scale that up to the whole of the UK, you come to about 23,000, which is pretty bad. But that's kind of northern. I think that's bottom of the range.
Okay.
If you scale it to, say, Bosnia scale or Syria scale, or then you have a very much larger number. It's quite tricky, and I said I'm sure. Many people are already thinking I'm being alarmist, so I don't want to just throw out just a bunch of scary numbers. But if people were to look at the average number of deaths in civil conflicts, you're looking at 1% to 4% of the population is entirely within the realm of possibility if you're on a Syria level scale. No, I don't think it's likely to get quite that that scale, but that's the range, somewhere between
23K and 500K.
Yeah, well, it's a big range, but I think a number in between. I'm sorry to be vague, but a number in between those is plausible. One is absolutely horrendous, and another is merely horrendous. I do think that there is going to be, leaving aside the numbers of people killed, there's going to be massive economic and social damage, and people are going to be uprooted in very large numbers. So it's going to be...
I'm looking to sell my house somewhere else, because I don't say where I live, but and move to somewhere outside London. Would you recommend I don't do that now? Buy a house in the outskirts of London?
I would leave it to you.
Well, I need your advice. I don't often speak to Civil War experts.
I would probably avoid the big cities. I would suggest that you reduce your exposure to the big cities, if you are as a matter of choice to decide. Then given what I've said, it would be weird if I concluded otherwise. So that would be my suggestion.
As a professor, I mean, you've spoken about the dangers of immigration and I think extreme Islamism. How have you avoided how you, sort of young woke people criticizing you? How has that been?
Well, I haven't avoided it completely, but I've avoided it, I would say, in the main, by, I think the facts speak in favor of the case I'm presenting. I'm not naive. I'm certainly not going to suggest that, I understand that what I'm saying is extremely unpleasant. But my point here is that in terms of our understanding of how society works, in terms of like what are the basic elements of a high functioning economy, of a democratic system which is perceived to be legitimate, in those terms, we have a fairly good understanding of how society works. And what I've just said is entirely in line with those understandings. In terms of our understanding of the current configuration of this society, everything I've just said is either drawn from specific government figures, our own government's statistical analyses, or those of reputable polling or other social science. Look, for example, the measures of trust. Trust is one of the most consistently measured things in modern social science. It's not controversial to say that there is a collapse of trust in Western society. Everybody, we know this completely. If I were to say things like people feel increasingly alienated from their governments and have less faith in the functioning of democratic systems, that's unpleasant, but it's not a controversial statement. People, you've had scholars from Sheldon Wolin in the United States talking about the rise of managed democracy for over 20 years. If I were to say, well, look, the West is reaching the end of its rope in terms of the financialization of its economies, and therefore our ability to maintain the coherence of an increasingly fractured society by paying people off is going to run out. That's not controversial. You don't have to struggle to find perfectly mainstream economists and find observers of the financial scene who point this out.
But the suggestion that mass immigration, that's just
immigration,
that is
for example.
Controversial, though.
Okay, so in 2013, Paul Collier is a very eminent UK scholar, impeccable reputation, writes a really important book called Exodus. The effect, or how I forget exactly the subtitle, but it's about migration and its effect on the world. His main focus is Britain, although he's trying to look at the effect both on the receiver countries and the sender countries. But he concludes in this book, he says, mass migration is a serious problem. Like mass uncontrolled is a serious problem because it reduces community mutual regard. It takes a country's national stock of social capital and drains it out. He bases that argument on the arguments of another academic named Robert Putnam. Putnam is effectively the grandfather of modern sociology. He is the most important figure associated with the idea of social capital. Putnam describes the impact of of diversity, effectively, on social capital, which he says is deleterious in a nutshell. So Collier writes this important book in 2013, and he says, this is a warning. Mass migration, don't do it. It has this very deleterious effect on society if you let it get out of control. He does conclude further, though. He says, look, we shouldn't have the politics of panic about this. We shouldn't have panic policies in regard to mass migration, but we shouldn't do uncontrolled mass migration. What happens? We had, 9 million, 11 million people to the country. It was, thank you very much, Professor Collier, and gone entirely the opposite direction. So all I'm trying to say to people, to your listeners and to government and to military, yes, I'm saying something very unpleasant and frightening, but it's not controversial in terms of our understanding of civil war causation and about how society works. This is all based on quite long-term research of multiple eminent scholars, mostly much more eminent than I. And so, I just want to say, dear elites, the consequences of your actions have arrived. And, I've already talked about the form of those consequences, but that's where we are.
Do you foresee in 10 years this might be an Islamic State, like what happened in Iran, Afghanistan, Lebanon?
Yeah, well, that was Vance's point, wasn't it? Yeah. No, I don't think so. On current, one can get to that scenario if you just play out. If you were to take certain demographic indicators, like pretty obviously, just straight up fertility rate, you could say, well, like Britain is on course, as a recent piece of research publicized just this week was saying, Britain is going to become a minority white country by 2063. In fact, that's I think that's a little alarming, but you should actually be a little bit more alarmed by that, because you'll have Britain will become a youth minority white country well before the overall. And so by the time you get to 2063, you'll have, assuming these figures, you'll have relatively quite old, tired, probably poor white population and a relatively youthful former minority population. So if we were to just play that
the simulation through
those simulations through, then yeah, you could make such an argument. But that's I think making a lot of assumptions about people's likely response to things. So I don't think that society is completely is so inert. When it comes down to it, and here, I'll admit, this is being very speculative, but honestly, I just don't think that the British people want to be displaced from their own country. There's a really great essay by Orwell. All Orwell's essays are great, but he writes in one of his essays, which is written in 1940. He said, and he's talking about England as a civilization, or England as a culture and its distinctiveness relative to other cultures. He's talking in the context of Europe at the time. So, he says, England as a civilization is as vital and as different and as unique in its own way as Spain or Italy or what have you. But he says in there, there's a line where he says, what is the difference of England from the perspective of 1940 as opposed to 1840? And his argument is in asking that question is he's saying, actually, what we have here is a continuous civilization in which there's not a great difference between 1840 and 1940. Yes, I mean, you've got phone boxes and steam trains and well, at that time, you've got the Second World War occurring, but that there is this continuous national entity, this continuous national or cultural idea called the Englishness, which exists and is recognizable from 1840 to 1940. I would say, I would seriously question, could you say from the perspective of 2025 that the England of 2040 and the England of 1940 will be you will see those as part of the same.
Yeah.
In between these periods, in between these 1840, 1940, 2040, somewhere between 1940 and 2040 occurs a break that terminates
what England was.
So in answer to your question, I know that was a bit long, I think people are going to reject that. They're going to reject, like they're and they are already. They will. People are already perceiving an urgency to act to prevent the loss of something that they feel very strongly about. Still, it's a button. It's a feeling in the solar plexus that perhaps many people have become unaccustomed to feeling. This is not surprising. They've been educated out of certain instincts. There are and acculturated in a manner in recent decades in a way that was probably designed explicitly to reduce that feeling, but it's still there. And I think what's happening now is people are getting the proverbial kick right in the solar plexus. And they know that if they don't, if they just lie back, if nothing happens, then, well, God help you. If Orwell's up in heaven and asks you, the question, what happened from 1940 to 2040, you're not going to be able to meet him with a straight face. Okay, so that's I think the situation. It is a moment of time where the existence of this idea that Orwell talks about, or the continuing existence of this idea that Orwell talked about in 1940, which is one that people feel affection for, even now, even at a distance, is very seriously in peril. And I do think, this is merely my opinion, and I don't have which is to say, I'm not trying to make a scholarly argument for this. It's just my gut feeling is that people are going to react against that, and how they react against that is the question. I hope that there's a grave potential for them to react in ways that just take us right off the scale, and I hope that doesn't occur. But we're at a very perilous moment.
What will you do the moment civil war comes into play? Will you try to be safe? If so, what measure will you take? Will you stand up and fight? What will you do? Because I gather you'd be on the side of what I suppose I called before the West. Against
I'm a Western man. I'm a quintessential, quintessential Western man. That's perfectly obvious. Why am I don't know why I'm hesitating. Of course, I'm not going anywhere. Ironic. I'm an immigrant to this country. I came here by choice. Of course, my ancestry is rooted in these islands, but they left 200 years ago and spent the intervening time in Canada before I came back. But so I'm an immigrant here, but I feel very connected to it, and I feel when I read that essay recently, that I mentioned Orwell's essay recently, I thought, I think there's something absolutely disreputable, that seriously historically disreputable that could happen, that is happening in some ways, or in every way, in fact. I would regret being a passive bystander to that. For what it's worth, I'm not going anywhere. I want things to work out for the best, and I'm not going to run.
I've got one more question for you, but where can people find your work?
Very easily to find my work. There are the two most accessible and recent papers of this are both found in a journal called Military Strategy Magazine. If people Google the words "Civil War Comes to the West," military strategy, they will find two articles by me in that journal.
I can link them below.
Okay, yeah, you can link them. There'll be a book probably in the spring, if events don't overtake us before then. And there are some other writings, but principally if people want to engage with what I've just said in a somewhat more structured and slightly less ruminative and off-the-cuff manner with the appropriate sourcing and sources of evidence, then they can look there and find it.
Who's a heretic you admire?
I'm going to go with Chesterton. I mean, it's pretty, I don't know, I gather you ask that question often. I don't know how many people pick Chesterton, but...
I think he might be the first heretic picked, but Andrew Doyle, a recent guest, spoke about a book that he wrote about a future Islamic State.
Right.
Like 100 years ago.
Okay. Right. I haven't read that one, but of course, one of his books was called Heretics, 1905, if I recall correctly. So I'm going to go with G.K. Chesterton. He was a marvelous essayist. He was, and I like to think of Chesterton as he's kind of like the heretic of heretics. He was writing at a time, I mean, he himself was an establishment figure, but he was very critical of the establishment. He was very pointed in his criticism of the monarchy, which he was at pains to point out to people is not a conservative force. The monarchy is very typically the monarchy is very typically subject to some of the craziest, most harebrained ideas. Probably. Anyway, you can read Chesterton, but my point is that this is an establishment figure who is critical of the establishment. He's an establishment figure at a point in which the establishment was becoming more secular in its outlook, and Chesterton was becoming actually a rather Orthodox Catholic, and overtly so. So I like Chesterton, and I feel. I feel some affinity for him, and I hope to be able to write as engagingly and as convincingly and as timelessly as he did. So that's my choice.
It's a beautiful heretic. And people, please go and get Professor David Betz's work. I'll put some links down below. He's been absolutely brilliant. And hit that like button. Keep watching this channel.